Fires, droughts, and floods have touched every corner of the globe over the last year, causing billions of dollars in damage. And it's the poorest countries being hit the hardest, despite being the smallest contributors to global warming. And this is raising the question, who should pick up the bill? Welcome to this week's DW Business Special. I'm Christy Platzen, coming to you from Berlin. A loss and damage fund for poor nations affected by climate catastrophes is a key topic on the agenda at this year's COP Climate Summit, currently taking place in Egypt this and next week. Joining me to talk about this, I have my colleague Louise Osborne from our Environment Department. Thanks for joining us here in the studio. And we're also happy to have joining us directly from COP, Preeti Bhandari. She works for the World Resources Institute as Senior Advisor in the Global Climate Program and Finance Center. Preeti, thank you so much for joining us. So, starting with...
Thank you for having me.
Thanks. So starting with you, Louise, you've written an article about loss and damage, which we'll actually link in the video here. What are we talking about when we say loss and damage in terms of climate catastrophes?
Okay, so as we know, extreme natural events are getting worse, and these are tied to climate change. So we're getting more severe storms, we're getting longer droughts, more wildfires, this kind of thing. And this is obviously causing a lot of damage to infrastructure, losing crops, for example, all this kind of thing. Homes are being lost, livelihoods, and then there are the non-economic losses like culture, and people are losing their lives as well.
Right.
And it's developing countries that are being hardest hit by this, as you said before. They're being disproportionately affected, although they have contributed little with regards to carbon dioxide emissions into the atmosphere that are causing this global warming. So they are calling to rich nations to provide some kind of compensation for them so that they can pay for these loss and damages.
Right. So, I mean, picking up exactly off of that, what we've heard out of COP so far is that small island states and developing countries have put the issue of loss and damage on the summit's formal agenda this year. They're now pushing for the creation of a dedicated fund to address the issue, as Louise said. Delegates and officials from over 200 countries are currently at COP, and that includes Pakistan, which in recent years has been hit by near constant climate disasters, most recently the massive flooding that left more than a third of the country underwater and killed over 1,700 people. That includes around 500 children. So at COP, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres had this warning. Let's take a look at what he had to say.
We are in the fight of our lives, and we are losing. Greenhouse gas emissions keep growing. Global temperatures keep rising. And our planet is fast approaching tipping points that will make climate chaos irreversible. We are on a highway to climate hell with our foot still on the accelerator.
Now, Louise, unfortunately, we know climate change-related disasters have been happening for quite some time now. Why is this a particular issue at this COP this year?
I mean, like you said, it's now on the agenda. This is actually the first time it's ever appeared on the agenda. But it's not the first time that it's ever been talked about. It was actually first kind of conceived by the Association of Small Island States back in 1991, so 30 years ago. And since then, it's been talked about kind of on and off, but it's never really been seriously considered. Last year, China, along with the developing countries, tried to put forward a proposition to have some kind of financial facility to deal with loss and damage, but it was rejected with the idea that this conversation would go on. And developing countries have really pushed for it to appear this year so that something can actually be done.
Yeah, understandably. I mean, so Preeti, you're there at COP. We know that the participants have agreed to discuss this topic. They said in terms of, quote, cooperation and facilitation, not, quote, liability or compensation. Can you talk to us about what the difference is here, why the hair splitting on these definitions?
Well, I think this is coming out of abundance of caution that if loss and damage is talked about in the context of compensation and liability, it may be construed as an admission of legal liability, opening the floodgates for lawsuits and a large outflow of funding in terms of legal compensation. But having said that, in 2015, when the Paris Agreement was forged, where loss and damage was actually included as an important article of the Paris Agreement, the cover decision had actually set to bed the issue of compensation and liability. And there was a clear articulation that talking about loss and damage is not about compensation and liability. But there has been that fear that it may turn out to be about compensation and liability. And that's why the developed countries were looking for some kind of an assurance. And when the agenda was adopted, the president of the COP very clearly articulated that it is in the context of cooperation and facilitation and not compensation and liability. And this was an important, I think, concession to get the agenda item also agreed to and adopted at this COP.
Sure, certainly. Well, I mean, talking about compensation, I want to talk about some numbers here for a second, and I'd like to return to the Pakistan example. The World Bank estimates that the flood damages and economic losses in the country are over $30 billion US, and further reconstruction needs in Pakistan are a further $16 billion. Just to put that in context, Germany says it is providing around $1 billion in humanitarian aid for Ukraine due to Russia's invasion, just to give you a scale of how big the destruction in Pakistan is. And we should also remember that Pakistan is responsible for less than 1% of CO2 emissions globally today. Now, we also know that the Earth getting warmer makes extreme weather events like flooding both more extreme and more likely to happen, and that greenhouse gas emissions, and primarily carbon dioxide, are responsible for heating our planet. Now, if we take a look at figures since industrialization, Europe has been the largest CO2 emitter. That's followed by the United States and China. Now, Preeti, the logic here from the countries affected by disasters seems to be to these richer countries: you made the mess, you clean it up. Would you say that there's an openness to loss and damage payments on the part of richer countries, on the part of countries that are producing the largest amount of CO2?
Well, we have seen some movement over the last 1 year, and particularly over the last 6 months, I would say. At the last conference in Scotland, the First Minister of Scotland actually pledged some funding for loss and damage. It was small funding, but it was also followed by the Wallonia region of Belgium. And some philanthropies as well. But you're talking about countries. So that actually kick-started the process of some pledging happening. And at this particular COP in Egypt, there are other countries who have made some funding announcements. This includes countries such as Austria, Canada, Belgium, New Zealand, and of course, Germany. Germany has established this mechanism called the Global Shield Against Climate Risk, and the Chancellor announced at the COP support to the tune of 170 million euros. But what one has to recognize is that while there is that willingness now to provide such funding, all this funding is being committed to initiatives which are outside the climate convention process. These are welcome pledges, but what developing countries are looking for is assurance under the multilateral process of the UN and a fund under the UN where there is a more level playing field on who gets funded, what gets funded, and there is that UN hallmark of consensual decision making. So while there have been some movement by rich countries to make pledges, what developing countries are looking for is pledges under the UN, under a fund which is under the UNFCCC.
Right, right. So essentially looking for kind of a UN endorsement of what they're asking for there. I mean, you touched on this a bit, but one thing I did sort of want to ask you about is, are there existing mechanisms in place to get these funds where they need to be? I mean, how does that work currently?
Currently, there is some financing flowing, but probably it is not labeled as loss and damage financing. One example is, if I can say, the humanitarian assistance. Once a disaster strikes, the UN system comes into place, the bilateral funding agencies come into place and provide humanitarian assistance. But humanitarian assistance is just one small part of the expanse of what loss and damage covers and what Louise talked about earlier also. So yes, there is this small amount of financing flowing through the humanitarian assistance, but there are also other funds which are under the UN, such as the Green Climate Fund and the Adaptation Fund. And according to an assessment which was also quoted in the sixth assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, about a quarter of the projects that the Green Climate Fund has financed until now, make some reference to loss and damage, and a subset of 16% are actually activities addressing loss and damage. So there are existing mechanisms, but those the mandates of these the mandates of these funds actually do not expressly address loss and damage.
All right, all right. Now, Louise, maybe back to you for a second. What are some of the sticking points and hurdles to moving this agenda along?
I mean, as Priti mentioned before, obviously liability is one of the issues. I mean, what exactly would countries, richer, industrialized nations, be responsible for paying for? That's, an issue. There's also the issue that China, the biggest emitter now, is not included as a country that would be putting money towards loss and damage. So they are not seen as being a historical emitter. They are seen as a developing nation, or they were seen as a developing nation at least. And so a lot of countries are saying that they should actually be involved in paying for those loss and damages. Developing nations are also calling for China to be involved in paying for that. There is also financing that's already in place. There's a $100 billion fund, for example, that is set aside for adaptation and mitigation measures. And industrialized nations say that perhaps loss and damage money could come out of that money, even though it's not actually at the place where it should be at the moment. It's not $100 billion. That is what has been pledged and what was promised.
But they're not reaching it.
But they've never reached it.
Yeah.
No, exactly. So, those are the main things that they're kind of arguing about. There's also obviously the issue of the US and the fact that they flat out refuse to give money to loss and damage at the moment. Maybe that will change over the next week. We'll have to see.
Okay. Yeah, talking about the next week, Priti, to you for our last question. What would you like to see happen at COP in the next few days?
I wish I had a crystal ball, but at the end of next week, I think what we need is a package of decisions which exhibit solidarity with developing countries. And it is not only about the issue of loss and damage and, coming in good faith to negotiate the agenda item on loss and damage, which has been put on the table after a long time, but it is also about financing adaptation. Finance is a big issue, and Louise just talked about the 100 billion pledge, which has not been met. And of course, there is a delivery plan which says it will be met in 2023. And in addition, there is a pledge about doubling adaptation financing. So assurances about the financing to flow, I think, would be an important part of the package. Accountability would be an important part of the package. And let's not forget the Paris Agreement and, following that, the Glasgow Pact did talk about an objective of a temperature increase of no more than 2 degrees, but preferably 1.5 degrees centigrade. That means a lot of mitigation or reduction of greenhouse gas emissions need to happen. And while countries have submitted their plans and pledges for reducing emissions, there is a need to enhance that ambition, because as of now, some reports, including an assessment done by the UN, says that we are on a pathway to a temperature rise of 2.8 degrees centigrade. So ambition in reducing emissions, solidarity in helping address adaptation and loss and damage in vulnerable countries, and accountability of all commitments, be it related to reducing emissions, but also the provision and mobilization of financing. It's a tall order. But that's where we need that leadership from across the board to help us, reach the finish line on 18th of November.
Certainly. Well, we'll have to leave it there for now, Preeti, but our Environment Department will be following further developments at COP into next week. I want to thank both Louise and Preeti for joining me here. And Preeti, we want to wish you good luck at the rest of COP, and Louise, good luck to you covering COP from here in Berlin over the next week. Now, don't forget to check out our other business specials here on YouTube. I'll catch you next week.